There is a moment in the story of Anakin Skywalker that almost no one talks about. Not Mustafar, not the Emperor's throne room, not the night the clones turned on their Jedi generals. Something else. A moment that happened outside of time, in a realm that most beings never knew existed. A god looked Anakin in the eye and asked him to stay, to become the new keeper of the balance, to take his place holding the Force itself together. Anakin said no, and that single refusal set the entire galaxy on fire. The fall, the Empire, the Purge, 2 decades of darkness. All of it flows back to that one moment, in that one place, where the man the universe had been building toward its whole life turned down the thing it was asking of him. But here is what makes the prophecy so strange, so much older and so much darker than anything you have been told. The ancient words written 10,000 years before Anakin drew his first breath had already accounted for the refusal. The Force does not move in straight lines. It moves through destruction, through failure, through the kind of fall that looks like the end of everything and turns out to be the only path to the thing the galaxy actually needed. This is the entire story of the Chosen One prophecy. And it goes back further than any Jedi ever told you. Further than the Republic, further than the Sith, all the way to the beginning of the Force itself. And the beings who first understood that balance would one day require a price no god was willing to pay. The Force is not simply a tool. It is not a power source that the Jedi draw from and the Sith corrupt. That understanding of it, though common, is thin. The Force is something far older and far stranger than any description of it can quite capture. It is the living energy that underlies all of reality, flowing through every creature, every plant, every stone, every dying star, connecting all things in an invisible web of causation and consequence. And like any living thing, it can fall out of balance. When it does, the results are not subtle. They ripple outward across the galaxy like tremors through still water, manifesting as wars and catastrophes, as the rise of empires and the fall of orders, as the birth of individuals whose lives seem almost too significant to be accidental. The Force does not suffer imbalance quietly. It corrects, slowly, painfully, over generations and millennia, through the lives and deaths of countless beings who never understood why they were where they were, doing what they were doing. But it corrects. The Force is not simply a tool. It is not a power source that the Jedi draw from and the Sith corrupt. That understanding of it, though common, is thin. The Force is something far older and far stranger than any description of it can quite capture. It is the living energy that underlies all of reality, flowing through every creature, every plant, every stone, every dying star, connecting all things in an invisible web of causation and consequence. And like any living thing, it can fall out of balance. When it does, the results are not subtle. They ripple outward across the galaxy like tremors through still water, manifesting as wars and catastrophes, as the rise of empires and the fall of orders, as the birth of individuals whose lives seem almost too significant to be accidental. The Force does not suffer imbalance quietly. It corrects, slowly, painfully, over generations and millennia, through the lives and deaths of countless beings who never understood why they were where they were, doing what they were doing. But it corrects. Before we can talk about what happens when the Force falls out of balance, We need to talk about the beings who were there at the very beginning. The ones who shaped the galaxy before recorded history began. The ones who built wonders that later civilizations would find in ruins and mistake for the work of nature. The Celestials. The Celestials were not gods in any religious sense, but they were close enough to it that the distinction barely matters. They were beings of such incomprehensible age and power that they reshaped the physical structure of the galaxy itself. They constructed Centerpoint Station, a structure so massive that it could pull entire planets out of their orbits. They created the Corellian system, arranging 5 inhabited worlds around a single sun, as a kind of demonstration of what was possible when you understood the universe at its foundations. They built the Cathol Rift and erected hyperspace barriers, and left behind ruins on dozens of worlds that surviving species would spend thousands of years trying to interpret. Their scale was different from anything that came after them. And yet, even they were subject to something greater. Even they answered, in their way, to the Force. In the sources that survived the ages, in fragments and references scattered through Jedi holocrons and the ancient hive memories of the Killik species, there are hints of a being called Abeloth. She was not a Celestial by birth. She was something else. Something mortal who had been brought into proximity with the Celestials when she became caretaker for a place called Mortis. Mortis was a realm outside ordinary space and time, a place where the Force itself was concentrated into something almost physical, almost inhabitable. It was a vergence on a cosmic scale, a wound in the ordinary universe through which the Force poured in overwhelming concentrations. And within Mortis lived 3 beings who embodied the Force in its most fundamental aspects: the Father, the Daughter, the Son. The Father maintained balance between them and between the principles they embodied. The Daughter represented the light side in its purest expression, the capacity for selflessness, for healing, for connection without possession. The Son embodied the dark side, not as corruption or malevolence in simple terms, but as the necessary shadow that gives light its meaning, the hunger and ambition and will to survive at any cost that is as much a part of living things as their capacity for love. The Father held them both. He was the equilibrium point, the still center around which the extremes revolved without destroying each other or the galaxy they were part of. Abeloth served them. She cleaned and tended, and kept the household of eternity. She loved them, loved the Father and the Daughter, and even the Son, in the way that someone loves a family they have chosen with full knowledge of what that family costs. And in her love, in her desire to become like them, to transcend the mortality that still clung to her while they existed in something beyond it, she did something that the Celestials had forbidden. She bathed in the pool of knowledge. She drank from the font of power. And what had been a mortal woman with mortal limitations became something the galaxy would spend hundreds of thousands of years trying to understand. Something hungry and vast and deeply wrong. A being of immense power who wanted to fill the emptiness inside her by absorbing other minds, by becoming everything, by dissolving the distinction between self and other, until nothing remained but her. The Celestials imprisoned her. There was no other option. The Father took on the role of warden, and the equilibrium of Mortis became a kind of eternal holding pattern, with the Daughter and Son maintained in tension, and Abeloth contained beyond the reach of the living galaxy. This arrangement worked. But like all arrangements that depend on a single point of maintenance, it was fragile. Because the Father was not truly immortal. He was long-lived beyond the comprehension of ordinary beings, but he was not permanent, and he knew it. What the Father understood, and what would eventually echo through the ancient texts as prophecy, is that balance in the Force is not a state, it is a practice. It requires an active agent, someone to stand in the middle of the storm and hold it steady, someone born with the capacity to feel both light and dark with equal depth and weight, to resist the pull of either extreme, to absorb the universe's contradictions without being destroyed by them. The Father was that being for an age beyond reckoning, but every age ends. And the question that Mortis posed to the galaxy, the question that the Father's very existence had answered, was what would happen when he was gone? Who would hold it then? Before his power faded, and before the equilibrium of Mortis began its long unraveling, something was set in motion. Whether it was a deliberate act, a final working of the Father's concentrated will, or simply what the Force itself desired in the deep instinctual way it tends towards self-correction, is not entirely clear even to those who studied it most carefully. But the result was that the idea of a champion, a chosen one who would restore balance in the galaxy's darkest hour, began to take shape in the currents of the Force. It was not yet a prophecy. It was not yet words on a page or impressions in a holocron. It was a pattern that the Force was already drawing in the lives of the beings who would later write it down. Long before that happened, while Mortis was still hidden and the ones were still alive, the galaxy was being populated by mortal Force users who had no idea what they were inheriting. On the deep core world of Tython, a civilization called the Jedi had emerged. They would eventually simply be called the Jedi. But at this early stage, they were something more philosophically complex than what that name would later suggest. They were willing to sit with the tension between light and dark without resolving it into a simple hierarchy. They built 9 temples on Tython, each dedicated to a different aspect of the Force's nature. They studied the Force from every angle available to mortal minds. They believed in something they called the Bendu, meaning balance, and they tried to embody it in their daily practice. For a long time, it worked. Tython flourished. The Jedi grew in wisdom and in numbers and in understanding. But mortal beings are not the Father. They do not have his particular relationship with the Force or his capacity for sustained neutrality. Over generations, certain Jedi began to feel that the light side was simply better, that the darkness they called Bogan was too dangerous to engage with at all, that wisdom lay in refusing it entirely rather than in understanding and containing it. Others moved in the opposite direction, finding that the power available through the dark side was too intoxicating to leave untouched, that the Jedi philosophy of balance was a comfortable theory for those not willing to reach as far as the Force allowed. Human nature does not sustain balance easily. It tends toward preference, and preference, over enough time, tends toward extremism. This is not a moral failure. It is simply what mortal beings do when they are left without the kind of guidance that the ones provided from Mortis. Without a father to hold the center does not hold. Around 24,500 years before the Battle of Yavin, a Jedi named Zendor crossed a line that had previously been theoretical. He embraced the dark side completely and without reservation. He gathered followers who felt the same way, and he rose against the orthodox Jedi in what history would remember as the First Great Schism. The first time that light and dark fought each other in the bodies of mortal Force users. It would not be the last. In fact, it would become the template for everything that followed, repeated again and again across thousands of years with different names and different weapons, but always the same underlying shape. The echoes of that conflict matter here because they are the context in which the earliest version of the Chosen One prophecy was born. The seers and scholars who survived the First Great Schism understood something their predecessors had not fully confronted. This would happen again. The darkness did not die when Xendor was defeated. It retreated. It waited. It would find new adherents and new philosophies and new justifications for the same impulse toward total domination that had driven Xendor. And someday, perhaps when the Jedi were least prepared for it, it would return in a form more devastating than anything they had yet imagined. The prophecy was not wishful thinking. It was pattern recognition. It was ancient scholars looking at the evidence of what the Force did when it fell seriously out of balance, and asking what kind of being would be necessary to restore it when the imbalance reached its worst expression. A Jedi seer from this period, whose name the records do not preserve with certainty, reportedly left behind texts that described visions of a figure at the center of a great storm. This figure was described in contradictory terms, as both cause and cure, as destroyer and redeemer, as someone who would unmake the world that knew him before making it again. These are not precise prophecies in the way that later generations would come to understand the term. They are impressions, emotional states, translated imperfectly into language by people trying to describe something the Force had shown them, without giving them adequate words for it. The Force does not speak in clear sentences. It speaks in feelings and images, in the intuitions of individuals who are sensitive enough to hear it and honest enough not to confuse its signal with their own desire. But there was another element in this early period that carries particular weight. Before the First Great Schism had fully resolved itself, before the dark side's adherents had been driven from Tython and scattered across the galaxy, one of the key figures in the conflict, a Jedi whose philosophical journey had taken him toward Bogan rather than Ashla, reportedly found something in his wandering that no other mortal had found before him. He found the gateway to Mortis. The records of what happened there are fragmentary, and the scholars who later analyzed what survived disagreed about the particulars. What the sources do agree on is that the Father spoke to him, showed him the nature of the balance, and explained what the Ones maintained and why the maintenance mattered on a scale that most beings would never grasp. The Father presumably showed him what happened when the balance broke, what Abeloth was capable of, what the galaxy would face if no one stood at the center to hold it. And the wandering Jedi listened and understood and left, unconvinced. He did not believe that the Father's model of balance was any more valid than his own interpretation of the Force. He had his philosophy, he had his path, and he returned to Tython and continued down it. This is significant for reasons that extend well beyond the First Great Schism itself. It means that at least one mortal Force user in the ancient era had direct knowledge of the Ones. It means that knowledge of Mortis, however fragmentary and however distorted by the passage of time and the limitations of language, entered the mainstream of Jedi thought and was preserved in various holocrons and texts that would survive into the era of the Republic Jedi Order. And it means that when ancient masters spoke of balance and of the need for a chosen figure to restore it, They were not speaking entirely from abstract spiritual intuition. They were drawing, however distantly, on a tradition that traced back to a direct encounter with the beings who embodied the Force's own self-understanding. After the First Great Schism, the Jedi reorganized. They dropped a letter from their name and became the Jedi Order. Over the following millennia, they relocated their center of gravity and eventually became the peacekeeping arm of what would grow into the Galactic Republic. In doing so, they also changed their relationship with the dark side in ways that seemed prudent at the time, but would have profound consequences. The balanced philosophy of the original Jedi gave way to a more systematic rejection of darkness, a decision that had its logic given what darkness had done in Xendor's hands. But it also meant that the Jedi increasingly interpreted their ancient texts through the lens of that rejection. And when it came to the Chosen One prophecy, that lens shaped everything about how they understood it. The words that the ancient seers had written about a figure who would bring balance, who would stand in the center of the storm, who would be born of the Force itself, in a way that defied ordinary biological explanation, were gradually reinterpreted to mean something more specific and more comfortable. They came to mean a being who would destroy the Sith. That interpretation was not entirely wrong, but it was partial. And that partiality would lead to thousands of years of misunderstanding about what the prophecy was actually asking for, what the Force was actually working toward. Now let us move to the second element of this story, the part where the words themselves were set down and where they began their long journey through time toward a boy in the desert. The Jedi Order was not one monolithic institution that thought with one mind across thousands of years. It was a civilization unto itself, spanning generations without number and dozens of different philosophical schools and regional traditions. Within that civilization, there were scholars whose entire purpose was to preserve and interpret the Force-related texts that had accumulated over millennia. These scholars were the guardians not just of knowledge, but of the prophecies, the visions, the recorded impressions of masters long dead who had felt something coming and had written down what they felt as best they could. The most important archive for understanding the Chosen One prophecy is a document known as the Journal of the Whills. The Journal of the Whills is not a straightforward text. It is more like a living record, something added to across thousands of years by different hands, in different traditions, and in different moments of crisis. What it preserved, among other things, were the oldest known versions of the Chosen One prophecy, and the record of how those versions changed over time, as new events and new understandings pressed themselves against the ancient words and reshaped their meaning. The oldest fragments of the prophecy that the journal contained were not about the Sith at all. They were about something far more fundamental and far more difficult to name. They spoke of a time of great darkness descending over the galaxy, of the Force itself, crying out as if wounded by something it could not absorb, of the stars going cold in a metaphorical sense, of the light in living things dimming below the threshold necessary for hope. And they spoke of a being who would emerge from that darkness, not separate from it but formed within it. Someone born in a way that defied ordinary explanation, someone whose connection to the Force was so extreme as to seem impossible by any normal measurement. This being, the oldest versions said, would absorb the darkness, would take it in rather than simply opposing it, would become the point of equilibrium between the storm's outer edge and its still center. And through that terrible act of holding the universe's contradiction inside a single mortal body, would bring the galaxy back to itself. That is a very different prophecy from the one the Jedi Council understood in the time of the Galactic Republic's final decades. The version the Council knew had been distilled to something elegant and simple, one who will bring balance to the Force and destroy the Sith. That version had been refined and narrowed over thousands of years of interpretation by scholars who lived in a galaxy where the Sith were the defining existential threat, where the endless conflict between Jedi and Sith had become so central to galactic history that it was natural, perhaps inevitable, to read every cosmic prophecy through that lens. But the older version did not mention the Sith. It spoke of agents of chaos, of those who would unmake the balance that living things needed to survive. The Sith were the most prominent example of such agents in any era of recorded history, but they were not the only example the Force had ever had in mind when it reached into the dreams of its most sensitive servants and showed them what was coming. Within the Journal of the Whills, there is a phrase that appears in multiple versions of the prophecy in slightly different forms across different eras of transcription. The phrase is this: Son of Sons. It is one of the most interesting pieces of the entire prophetic tradition, precisely because it resists obvious interpretation. The most straightforward reading is that the Chosen One would be a descendant of something, a being in whom the Force had been concentrating itself across a long sequence of preparatory lives, a being who stood at the end of a lineage that the Force had been cultivating without the knowledge of the beings involved. Some scholars interpreted it as a reference to bloodline, to the idea that the Chosen One's genetics were themselves somehow special, that the Force had been selecting for particular combinations of sensitivity and strength across generations. But there was another reading, one that made considerably more sense when placed alongside the Mortis mythology that the journal also preserved. Son of Sons could be understood as Son of the Sun, a reference to the Ones, a descendant or heir, not in any biological sense but in a cosmic and functional sense, of the principles that the son and the daughter of Mortis had embodied. In this reading, the Chosen One would be someone who carried within themselves the same dual nature that the Father had held in equilibrium, someone who could contain both light and dark, without being consumed by either, in the same way that the Father had contained them across an age beyond mortal comprehension. The prophecy was not asking for a Jedi who would defeat the Sith in battle. It was asking for a new father, a mortal father, a being who could do for the galaxy what the Ones had done for Mortis, without the advantage of divine nature or infinite time. That interpretation troubled the Jedi Order when scholars raised it, and the archives suggest it was largely set aside in favor of the more comfortable version. The Jedi were deeply committed to the understanding that the light side was the appropriate and correct relationship to the Force. The idea that the Chosen One needed to be someone capable of genuinely embodying darkness as well as light, someone who could not fulfill their purpose without containing both, was theologically uncomfortable in ways that the Order could not easily accommodate. It implied something the Jedi preferred not to examine too closely, that perhaps balance did not mean the victory of the light, that perhaps it meant something stranger and harder than that, the reconciliation of the two, the absorption rather than the destruction. There was another layer to the prophecy that deserves attention. The version of the text that spoke of the Chosen One's birth described a being who was conceived without a father in the ordinary biological sense. The language used was not entirely unambiguous across different translations, but the image remained consistent through multiple traditions and multiple millennia of independent interpretation. This would be a being born directly of the Force itself, not in the sense that the Force had influenced a normal conception to increase a child's sensitivity, which happened to varying degrees with many Force-sensitive beings, but in the more fundamental sense that the Force itself was the only parent. That the Force had reached into the physical world and produced a body capable of holding what it needed to hold. This image was connected in the earliest versions of the prophecy to language about grief and suffering. The Chosen One would come from a place of loss, would understand at the very center of their being what it meant to have nothing, to be powerless, to exist at the mercy of circumstances beyond their control. And that understanding would not be incidental to their purpose. It would be foundational, because the balance the Force needed was not the balance of someone who had never known darkness, who had lived in comfort and order, and never been required to feel what the bottom actually felt like. The prophecy was describing a being who had been shaped by suffering in the same way that iron is shaped by fire, and who would carry that shaping into the moment the galaxy needed them most. The prophecy, as the Jedi understood it in the final centuries before Anakin Skywalker's birth, had been compressed to something a council member could summarize in a single sentence. And in that compression, most of the texture had been lost. The Mortis imagery was known to scholars, but not widely understood. The Son of Suns language was debated in seminars and set aside. The idea that the Chosen One might need to absorb darkness rather than simply destroy it was too uncomfortable to live in the mainstream. What remained was a promise that was easier to hold. Someone is coming who will fix everything. And the Jedi, who were beginning in this period to develop the kind of institutional complacency that comes from too long a run of success, were comfortable with that simpler version. Too comfortable. As it would turn out, the Sith were not comfortable. The Sith were paying extremely close attention. Here is a thing that is easy to miss in the telling of this story. The Chosen One prophecy was not secret Jedi knowledge. The Sith knew about it. They had their own copies of the ancient texts, their own archives of the prophetic tradition, their own interpretive traditions that had developed alongside the Jedi's over thousands of years of parallel existence. And the Sith understanding of the prophecy was different from the Jedi's in ways that are deeply revealing about both traditions. For the Jedi, the prophecy was a source of hope. Someone is coming who will fix everything. For the Sith, the same prophecy was a threat, but it was also something else. It was a confirmation of something they had always suspected. The Force itself was invested in the outcome. The Force was working toward balance, which meant that the dark side's domination was something the Force was actively working to correct. That was important information. It meant that any Sith Lord who wanted to secure a permanent victory for the dark side needed to do one of two things. Either identify and eliminate the Chosen One before the prophecy could be fulfilled, or find a way to control the Chosen One, to turn the Force's own instrument of correction into a weapon for the darkness it was meant to correct. If you could do the latter, you would have achieved something that no Sith had ever quite managed. You would have used the Force against itself. In the centuries before Anakin's birth, the Sith had been reduced to 2 practitioners at any given time. Following the rule of 2 established by Darth Bane after the cataclysm of Ruusan, the rule of 2 was itself a kind of indirect response to the prophetic tradition, though Bane did not necessarily frame it in those terms. Bane understood that the Sith had been their own worst enemy for millennia, that the tradition of many Sith competing for dominance produced practitioners who were powerful in isolation but collectively self-defeating, By restricting the Sith to a single master and a single apprentice at any moment, he created a chain in which all of the dark side's accumulated power and knowledge flowed continuously forward, strengthening with each link, building toward a moment of concentrated force that could finally crack the Republic and the Jedi Order open. The Sith who followed Bane's line understood that a prophecy about a being born directly of the Force itself was not something they could afford to ignore or dismiss. They researched it. They cross-referenced it against their own dark side lore about vergences and concentrations of Force energy. They debated what it meant and when it might arrive. And the Sith Master who understood it most deeply, who approached it with the most rigorous analytical intelligence the dark side had ever produced, was a Bith Lord named Darth Tenebrous. Tenebrous was not a Sith in the mold of the conquerors and the warriors. He was something closer to a scientist, a being for whom the dark side was an object of study as much as a source of power. He believed the Force could be mapped and measured and predicted if you were careful enough and patient enough. His research into what he called vergences, the concentrations of Force energy that occasionally produced beings of unusual sensitivity, led him to a conclusion that would have chilled anyone who heard it, stated plainly. A vergence of unprecedented scale was approaching. The Force was preparing something, based on his calculations, based on his reading of the ancient texts and the living patterns of midichlorian activity he could detect in the beings around him. It was going to produce a being of such extreme power that nothing the Sith had ever produced or the Jedi had ever trained could stand against it without extraordinary preparation. Tenebrous believed this being would destroy the Sith, not out of any particular animus toward them, not even necessarily because the being would choose the Jedi, but because the Force was working toward balance, and the Sith's sustained domination of events through decades of political manipulation had created an imbalance severe enough that the Force's correction was going to be proportionally extreme. The instrument the Force produced would be proportional to the problem it was meant to solve. And the problem the Force had been accumulating energy to solve was very large indeed. The only way to survive the coming of the Chosen One, Tenebrous concluded, was to be positioned so dominantly when the being arrived that the Sith could either control or neutralize the threat before it developed fully. This is why the long game of the Rule of Two mattered so much. The timeline was not abstract for Tenebrous. He was preparing with the cold analytical patience that the Rule of Two demanded for a specific opponent whose arrival he could predict but whose exact nature he could not control. And he passed that understanding, along with everything else he knew about the dark side and the Force's deepest workings, to his apprentice. His apprentice was a Moon named Hago Damask, who would be known to history as Darth Plagueis. And Darth Plagueis was perhaps the most intellectually ambitious Sith Lord who had ever lived, and the most directly relevant to the story of what Anakin Skywalker actually was. Plagueis understood that the prophecy's central element, the being born of the Force itself without a biological father, was not metaphorical. He took it literally. He believed it was describing an actual biological event, something that had either happened before in the galaxy's long history or was going to happen, in which the Force intervened directly in the physical world to produce a body capable of carrying the power it needed to place somewhere. And he dedicated decades of research to understanding how such a thing was physically possible, and whether, if it was possible, it could be replicated or predicted or controlled. What Plagueis discovered through experiments that would have horrified the Jedi and disgusted even most Sith, was that the midichlorians could be influenced. The midichlorians were not simply passive indicators of Force sensitivity. They were the interface between the living world and the Force itself, the biological mechanism through which the Force expressed itself in flesh. And as an interface, they could, under certain circumstances and with certain techniques, be encouraged to act in ways that normal biology would not produce, could be made to create life where no life had been initiated by ordinary means, could be manipulated to enhance or extend the life already present in a living body. The Force had always done this on its own when it chose to. Plagueis wanted to learn to do it deliberately. His experiments across decades with his master, and then alone, and then with his own apprentice, were extensive and deeply unethical. He experimented on living beings. He pushed the boundaries of what the midichlorians would do when subjected to sustained dark side pressure and sustained attempts at manipulation. He killed things and brought them back and studied what changed in the process. He was not doing this for cruelty's sake. Though the line between his purpose and cruelty was thin enough that the distinction may not have mattered to his subject, he was doing it because he believed the answer to the most important question the Sith had ever faced was somewhere in the biology of Force sensitivity, and he was going to find it. His apprentice was a young man from Naboo named Sheev Palpatine, who would be known to the Sith as Darth Sidious, and would be known to history as the Emperor who destroyed the Jedi Order and ruled the galaxy for 2 decades. Together, Plagueis and Sidious shared everything. The research, the experiments, the long-term plans for the galaxy, the understanding of what the Chosen One prophecy meant and what needed to be done about it. And here is the question that the evidence raises without ever quite answering. The question that sits at the center of Anakin Skywalker's story like a stone in still water. What if they did it? What if Plagueis and Sidious, working together in secret, used the techniques that decades of dark side experimentation had produced and influenced the midichlorians in Shmi Skywalker's womb and produced a child? What if the Chosen One of the ancient Jedi prophecy was himself a Sith creation? The evidence for this is circumstantial, but it is not thin. Shmi Skywalker could not explain her son's conception. There had been no father. She said this plainly and without apparent embarrassment, because she was a woman who dealt in facts, and the fact was simply that she had no explanation. Anakin's midichlorian count, when Qui-Gon Jinn measured it years later, was over 20,000, the highest count ever recorded in the history of the Jedi Order was in the low tens of thousands. Anakin's number was not just higher, it was categorically different, in the way that a hurricane is not just windier than a breeze, but belongs to a different order of magnitude entirely. It was the count of a being the Force had specifically produced, not simply one it had favored. In Revenge of the Sith, when Palpatine sits with Anakin in the Opera House and tells him the tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise, he says something that the film presents as a story, but that may in fact be a confession. He says that Plagueis could create life using the midichlorians. He does not say that he himself did this. He does not need to. The implication is available for anyone willing to follow it to its destination. The Sith had 2 possible motives for creating the Chosen One, and they were not mutually exclusive. The first was control. If you created the most powerful Force user who would ever live and shape the circumstances of their early life carefully enough, Perhaps you could ensure that when the moment of the prophecy's fulfillment arrived, that being was on your side rather than opposed to you. The second motive was subtler and stranger, and it speaks to the particular darkness of Plagueis' thinking. Plagueis had become obsessed with the idea of using midichlorian manipulation to prevent death, to create a state in which the Force could not take a life that the Sith wished to preserve. If the Force was going to produce a being of unprecedented power to correct an imbalance the Sith had created, then perhaps the only way to defeat that inevitability was to be the ones who produced the being, to take the Force's own mechanism of correction and put it in a body that you had made, a body that owed its existence to you, and then to corrupt it, to take what the Force had intended as its answer and turn it into the question no one was asking. If this is what happened, then what the Force did in response is the most extraordinary part of the story. Because the Force is not passive, it does not simply accept the terms offered to it. It corrects. And if the Sith created the instrument of their own destruction, if Plagueis and Sidious shaped the midichlorians of Shmi Skywalker's womb to produce a weapon, and the Force used that weapon for its own purposes instead, then the dark side's greatest act of defiance was also its greatest mistake. The thing they built to save themselves was the thing that ended them. That would be, in its way, a kind of perfect cosmic justice, but it would also be, in its way, profoundly sad. Because if Anakin was created by Sith manipulation rather than simply by the Force's unassisted will, then the child on Tatooine, the boy who raced pods and dreamed of the stars and loved his mother with an intensity that the Jedi would always view with discomfort, was born into a story that had already been written for him before he drew his first breath. He was someone else's answer to someone else's question, and he would spend his entire life trying to understand who he was supposed to be, never quite finding an answer that did not require him to surrender something essential of himself. It is worth pausing here to appreciate the sheer strangeness of what Plagueis and Sidious represented in the context of this story. For thousands of years, the Sith had positioned themselves as the enemies of balance, as the beings who tipped the scales deliberately toward darkness, and held them there by force of will and cruelty and ruthless intelligence. And yet, in their attempt to preempt the prophecy, in their long research into the midichlorians and life creation, they may have become the very mechanism by which the prophecy was fulfilled. The Force was not passive in the face of their manipulation. The Force is never passive. It absorbs, it redirects, it uses what it is given, and if the Sith handed it an instrument of incomprehensible power by trying to build the weapon that would defeat it, then the Force simply took that instrument and pointed it in the direction it had always intended. But we are getting ahead of events. Before any of this could unfold, before the prophecy could approach anything like its fulfillment, there was first a boy, a very small boy, living with his mother in the desert, knowing nothing about Celestials or Ones or the Journal of the Wills or the decades of dark side experimentation that may have produced him, knowing only that he was free in his mind even when not in his body, and that someday, somehow, he was going to leave Tatooine and see the stars. His name was Anakin Skywalker. Tatooine is a world that does not encourage hope. It is a desert planet orbiting twin suns at the outer edge of the rim, far from the centers of Republican power and civilization, governed not by the Senate whose laws technically applied there, but by the Hutts whose enforcement was the only law that practically mattered. The slave quarters of Mos Espa were places of hard work and harder luck, where people survived by being useful and hoped to last another year by being careful, and where the horizon was a flat line of sand and sky that went on in all directions without offering anything like a way out. This was not the kind of world you would expect to be the birthplace of a cosmic answer to a cosmic question, which was, perhaps, exactly the point. The Force did not favor the comfortable. The oldest fragments of the prophecy had said so clearly enough for anyone who still read the old versions. The Chosen One would come from grief, would understand powerlessness in the bone-deep way that only someone who had actually been powerless could. And there was no more perfect laboratory for that understanding than a slave quarter on a hut-controlled desert world at the edge of nowhere. In Mos Espa, a woman named Shmi Skywalker had given birth to a son approximately 9 years before a Jedi Master named Qui-Gon Jinn would arrive looking for hyperdrive parts and encounter the being the ancient prophecy had been describing. Shmi could not explain her son's conception. There had been no father. She said this without apparent mysticism, because she was not a mystical woman. She was a practical woman in an impractical situation. And the fact was simply the fact. She had carried and delivered a child, and there had been no father involved. She did not have a framework for understanding what that meant in the larger context of galactic history and Force-sensitive prophecy. She had a child, and that child, from his earliest days, was remarkable in ways that no normal understanding of biology or chance could adequately explain. Anakin's reflexes were beyond anything a human body should have been capable of. His ability to sense what was happening around him, to anticipate movement before it fully occurred, to react to events a fraction of a moment before they manifested in the physical world, was so far outside the range of normal human performance as to seem like a different category of existence altogether. He could pilot machinery at speeds and with a precision that experienced adult pilots could not match. He could build things, not just tinker with salvage, but genuinely engineer complex systems from components that had no obvious relationship to the thing he was making, driven by an intuitive understanding of how mechanical systems worked that should not have existed in a 9-year-old's mind. There was something about him that seemed to fold the near future back into the present moment, as if he existed in 2 instants simultaneously, the one he was living in and the one just ahead of it. What Qui-Gon Jinn discovered when he ran a blood sample was the number that changed everything. Midichlorians are present in the cells of all living things, but in varying concentrations that correspond to Force sensitivity. A typical person might have around 2,000 per cell. A being with meaningful Force sensitivity might have 5,000, 8,000, 10,000. Jedi Masters of high rank averaged around 10 to 12,000. Yoda, the Grand Master of the Order, measured in the high tens of thousands. That count was, for all practical purposes, the ceiling, the upper limit of what any living being had ever been recorded as carrying. Anakin's count was over 20,000. There is no adequate way to convey what that number meant to Qui-Gon Jinn when he read it. It was not simply high. It was not simply unusual. It was categorically different from anything the Order had ever encountered. It was the kind of number that suggested not a being who was very sensitive to the Force, not even a being who was extraordinarily sensitive to the Force, but a being who was, in some sense, made of it. A being in whom the Force had concentrated itself to a degree that the measurements available to the Jedi could barely contain. It was the number the ancient prophecies had been describing. The count of someone the Force had not merely favored, but specifically produced. Qui-Gon Jinn was not a man who required a long deliberation before arriving at a conviction. That was both his defining strength and the quality that had kept him at a permanent distance from the Jedi Council's inner circle throughout his career. He trusted the Force in a way that went beyond doctrine and beyond the interpretive tradition of the Order and beyond what the Council was generally comfortable with. He felt things deeply and acted on what he felt without requiring the institutional approval that most Jedi sought as confirmation. When he watched Anakin move through the world, when he saw the boy pilot and build and simply be, with a presence and a sureness that had nothing to do with arrogance and everything to do with a deep native connection to something none of the other beings around him could feel as clearly, he knew, not thought, knew. He took the blood sample. He ran the count, and the number confirmed what the Force had already told him before he asked. He brought the boy to Coruscant. He stood before the Jedi Council in their high chamber above the planet's endless city and presented his case. The boy had been born without a father. His midichlorian count exceeded anything in recorded Jedi history. He was the chosen one of the ancient prophecy, the being the Journal of the Wills had described, the answer to the question the Force had been building toward for thousands of years. And Qui-Gon wanted to train him. The Council's response was not what he had hoped for. Yoda looked at the boy and spoke of the fear he sensed in him. Fear, the ancient teaching said, was the beginning of the path to the dark side. A boy carrying this level of Force sensitivity. A boy who was this connected to the energy that flowed through all living things. With that much fear attached to the mother he had left behind on Tatooine, with that much uncertainty about his future, with all the emotional weight of a childhood spent in slavery pressing against the walls of his chest, was not a safe investment by the standards the Council applied to such decisions. He was a gamble of the largest possible kind, but there was something else in that chamber that day, something that is worth sitting with. Behind the measured skepticism, behind the procedural caution, behind the genuine and legitimate concern about Anakin's age and his emotional state, there was something that looked very much like a different kind of fear. The Council was afraid of what Anakin represented. Not of the 9-year-old with the desert dust still on his boots, but of what his existence meant. If Qui-Gon was right, if this child was genuinely the chosen one of the ancient prophecy, then the prophecy was no longer theoretical. It was standing in their meeting room. And that meant the galaxy they knew, the Order they had spent thousands of years building, the Republic they had served across generations, was on the edge of a change so enormous that no one could predict its shape. And the Jedi Order had survived as long as it had, in large part by being very skilled at managing uncertainty. What Anakin represented was uncertainty of a kind that could not be managed. They denied the request. The boy was too old to begin training. There was too much fear in him. They would not take him, and for a brief moment, it seemed as if the ancient prophecy might simply remain unfulfilled, its instrument growing up as a slave on Tatooine, dying in a sandstorm or a race, never knowing what the Force had made him for. Then the battle on Naboo began. Then Darth Maul arrived, and the duel in the plasma generator, and everything moved too fast after that for the Council to maintain their position. And Qui-Gon Jinn lay dying on the floor with his apprentice kneeling beside him, And his last words, the last words of the man who had understood Anakin better than anyone else alive, were a request. Train the boy. Obi-Wan, train the boy. Promise me. Obi-Wan Kenobi promised. And the council, who had refused Qui-Gon in life, granted him his wish in death. Qui-Gon Jinn is one of the most important figures in the entire story of the Chosen One prophecy, and his importance lies not in any single action, but in the nature of his belief and in what that belief cost him. He was not a perfect Jedi by the standards the Order used to measure such things. He was too independent, too willing to trust his instincts over the Council's deliberated consensus, too prone to taking on causes the Order would have preferred to leave alone. His relationship with the living Force, with the conviction that the Force spoke most clearly through the immediate and the personal, rather than through the grand institutional abstractions, put him at odds with an Order that had come to favor the abstract over the immediate. But that relationship with the living Force was precisely what allowed him to recognize Anakin when no one else would have. The Jedi Council looked at the boy and ran an assessment and arrived at a cautious conclusion that was probably correct within the framework they were using. Qui-Gon looked at the boy and felt the Force singing through him like a frequency that bypassed all ordinary perception and went straight to something prior to thought, and he understood with a certainty that did not need evidence, because it preceded evidence that this was the one. The child, the galaxy, had been waiting for. The answer to the ancient question. He had believed in the Chosen One prophecy long before he found Anakin. Not as a theory to be debated in seminars, not as a historical curiosity to be filed in the archives, but as a living expectation. He was waiting for the Chosen One, the way someone waits for a thing they have been told is coming, with a readiness that never quite resolved into impatience, with eyes that had been trained through years of attention to the Force's subtle signals, to recognize a particular shape when it appeared. And then the shape appeared in the back room of a junk shop in Mos Espa, dusty and barefoot and entirely unaware of what it was. The tragedy of Qui-Gon Jinn, the element of his story that the careful reader cannot avoid sitting with, is that he was taken before he could see it unfold. Darth Maul's blade found the wrong man, if we want to speak in terms of what the prophecy seemed to require. The one Jedi who understood what Anakin was in the fullest sense, who possessed both the philosophical framework and the personal relationship with the living Force, to train him in the way the prophecy might actually demand, rather than simply the way the Order prescribed, was gone. In his place, Obi-Wan Kenobi, younger and more shaped by convention, and more bound by the Order's standard approach to almost everything, inherited a boy who needed something that the standard approach could not quite provide. Obi-Wan was not a lesser man than Qui-Gon. In many respects, he was a finer one, more disciplined, more careful, more genuinely wise in the institutional sense. He would become, in time, one of the greatest Jedi the Order ever produced. But he was not the teacher Anakin needed. And for years, that mismatch would produce exactly the kind of tension and strain and longing for something more that could be exploited by someone who understood Anakin far better than his own master did. Someone who had been watching Anakin from the moment he arrived on Coruscant. Someone who, if the darkest reading of events is correct, had been planning for him since before he was born. Obi-Wan understood the prophecy's weight in his own way. He understood that calling a child the Chosen One, the center of a cosmic prophecy, the answer to a 10,000-year question, was not a gift you were giving the child. It was a burden of the most extreme kind. Because when you are the chosen one, everything that happens to you gets filtered through that identity. Your choices are never simply your choices. Your failures are never simply your failures. Your darkness is the darkness of someone who was supposed to bring the light. And that is a weight that no child should carry. And yet Anakin carried it from the moment Qui-Gon named him for it. And the naming did not end when Qui-Gon died. The prophecy was shaping Anakin's life before he was old enough to understand what a prophecy was. It was shaping it in the way other Jedi spoke of him, in the Council's complicated mixture of wariness and desperate hope whenever they evaluated him, in Palpatine's steady and relentless and perfectly calibrated attention to him across the years of his training, in the expectations that accumulated around him like sand around a stone, slowly, in ways that were nearly invisible until you stepped back and saw how deeply buried the stone had become. Everything that was coming had been set in motion long before a boy named Anakin ever walked out of the desert and into the rest of galactic history. The stars above Tatooine had watched things rise and fall for longer than any civilization had yet managed to record. The Force had been concentrating itself and cultivating conditions and selecting for what it needed across timescales that made individual lives seem like single heartbeats in a very long piece of music. And now, finally, after all of that, it had arrived at its answer. Whether that answer would be given correctly, whether the being the Force had prepared would be allowed to become what the ancient words had described, whether the Jedi Order would understand in time what they were actually dealing with. Those were different questions. And the answers to those questions would not arrive for another 2 decades. Through a fall so complete and a redemption so unlikely that even the most optimistic of the ancient seers might have hesitated to predict it. But the instrument was in place. The chosen one had arrived, and whatever had made him Force or Sith or some combination of the two that no mortal mind had fully untangled, he was here. The ancient seers had written of a being who would absorb the darkness and hold the center of the storm. The storm was coming, and in a slave quarter in the desert, behind a door in Mos Espa, the center of it was sleeping. There is a version of this story that the Jedi Council told themselves in the years after Qui-Gon's death. And it is a comforting story, and it is also incomplete. In that version, the Chosen One was found. The Chosen One was trained. The Chosen One would in time fulfill his destiny and bring balance to the Force, and the role of the Jedi Order was simply to guide him safely to that moment. It was the story of an institution that believed it was still in control, that the prophecy was something it was administering rather than something that was happening to it, that the Force, in its ancient wisdom, had placed this extraordinary child in their hands because they were the appropriate vessel for such a responsibility. This version of the story made the Jedi feel necessary. It gave the prophecy a familiar shape. And it was wrong in ways that would cost everything. What the Council could not fully accommodate was the possibility that the prophecy was not designed to work through them, that the Force had its own understanding of how the balance would be restored, and that understanding was not identical to the Jedi's preferred version. The Jedi had, over thousands of years, developed a particular picture of what balance looked like. It looked like the dark side defeated. It looked like the Sith destroyed. It looked like peace, which in the Jedi's mind meant the absence of darkness rather than the presence of equilibrium. This picture was not wrong exactly, but it was partial, and the partiality mattered because it meant that when the Chosen One began to show aspects of himself that did not fit the picture, the institution's instinct was to correct him rather than to understand him. Anakin Skywalker grew up inside the Jedi Order as someone who was simultaneously its most important member and its most uncomfortable one. His power was never in question. It was evident from the beginning, and it only grew across the years of his training, expanding into capabilities that even experienced masters found difficult to look at directly. He could feel the Force in ways that others could not, could draw on it in quantities that exceeded what the Order's existing framework knew how to describe. But alongside that power came everything the Council had feared when he was 9 years old. The emotions, the attachments, the hunger for certainty in a universe that the Jedi tradition insisted could not be held to certainty without falling into darkness. He loved his mother. He could not let that go. He had dreams about her suffering long before he received any external confirmation that she was in danger. And the Order's response to those dreams was to teach him to release the attachment rather than to honor what the living Force was trying to show him through it. When he finally reached Tatooine and found her dying after her captivity with the Tusken Raiders, and when the grief and rage that he had been told to suppress found its expression in violence, the Order did not know how to hold that. They did not have a way to say that what he had felt was real and legitimate, and also something that required redirection rather than suppression. They could only tell him it was wrong, and Anakin Skywalker, who had never quite believed the things he felt were wrong, filed that away in the same place where he filed every other time the Order had told him to be less than he was. Palpatine knew exactly where that file was kept. He had been watching Anakin since the moment the boy arrived on Coruscant, had been studying the shape of his needs and his wounds and his hungers with the patient attention of someone who understood that the most powerful being in the galaxy was also the most exploitable one, if you found the right leverage and applied it at the right moment. He cultivated a relationship with Anakin that the Jedi could not offer. He was present. He listened. He validated. He told Anakin that his power was not something to be afraid of, but something to embrace. He told him that the Jedi's insistence on detachment was a philosophy designed by lesser beings to manage greater ones. He told him, again and again, across years of careful cultivation, that Anakin's feelings were not his weakness. They were his strength, and Palpatine knew, with the deep instinct of a Sith Lord who had spent decades studying the prophecy and the being it described, that Anakin's deepest feeling was the one that would bring him across. The dreams of Padme dying in childbirth were the hinge on which everything turned. Anakin had already proven that he would violate every principle of the Jedi Order to protect the people he loved. He had proven it on Tatooine. He had proven it in the way he had married Padme in secret and built a life in the shadows that the Order never officially acknowledged. He had proven it in every moment when his commitment to a specific person outweighed his commitment to an abstract principle. The dreams were not incidental to Palpatine's plan. They were the instrument. Because Anakin Skywalker, given a vision of losing the person he loved most, and given what appeared to be a way to prevent it, would walk through any door that was offered. And Palpatine had been building a door for years. The offer came in layers. First, the suggestion that dark side knowledge contained secrets the Jedi had never been willing to explore. Then the story of Darth Plagueis, who had studied the manipulation of life itself and had come close, so close, to understanding how to prevent the death of those he wished to preserve. Then the implication, made carefully enough to be deniable, that this knowledge had not died with Plagueis, that it might be accessible to someone willing to reach for it, that the boundary between the living and the dead, between what was and what need not be, was something that could be managed by someone with enough power and enough will to try. Anakin crossed. It was not a single step. It was a series of steps, each one comprehensible in isolation, each one requiring a small additional surrender of something he had been taught to protect. He turned against Mace Windu not because he believed Windu was wrong about Palpatine, but because he needed Palpatine alive long enough to learn what Palpatine had promised to teach him. He massacred the Separatist leaders on Mustafar not because he had become a monster overnight, but because he was following the logic of a deal he had made, trying to prove his commitment to the being he now believed was his only path to saving Padme. He accepted the name Darth Vader, not because he felt like Darth Vader, but because the Sith identity was the container for everything the Jedi had refused to let him be. What happened next was not, from a certain angle, the destruction of the prophecy. It looked like destruction. It looked like the Chosen One turning against everything the prophecy was supposed to serve. The Jedi wiped out in a night of blood and fire. The galaxy plunged into an era of darkness that would last for a generation. But something strange was true about the prophecy throughout those years of Vader and the Empire. Something worth sitting with in the dark. The Jedi had always interpreted balance to mean the victory of the light, but the Force had never said that. The Force had only said that someone would come and bring balance. And in the years of the Empire, something like balance did exist. In the darkest possible sense, the Jedi were gone. The Sith were two again, as they had been under the rule of two, a master and an apprentice. Darkness, embodied in exactly the proportion that the rule had maintained across 1,000 years. Was this balance? From the coldest possible perspective, from the perspective of someone counting the weight of light and dark, without reference to which was better, it might have been argued that what existed under the Empire was a kind of terrible equilibrium. The Jedi had been dominant for 1,000 years without significant opposition, convinced that their own supremacy was the same thing as balance. The Sith had corrected that dominance, violently and completely. What remained was not peace, but it was not pure chaos either. It was a darkness held in shape by the will of two beings, one of whom was the Chosen One, under a different name, wearing different armor, serving purposes he would not have recognized as his own if you had described them to him 15 years earlier. Before we move further into the Empire years, there is someone who deserves attention in the story of the Chosen One prophecy. Someone who is easy to overlook because his arc seems like a detour from the main story, but who actually illuminates something crucial about the prophecy and about the nature of self-deception on the grandest possible scale. That person is Count Dooku, Darth Tyrannus, former Jedi Master, former member of the Council, a man who, by some accounts, genuinely believed himself to be the Chosen One. Dooku's fall from the Jedi Order came before Anakin's. He left before the Clone Wars, disillusioned by what he saw as the Order's moral compromise in service of a corrupt republic. And his disillusionment was not entirely wrong. The Republic was corrupt. The Jedi had become its instrument in ways that the Order's founders would not have recognized as the peacekeeping role they had once envisioned. Dooku saw this clearly. With the analytical precision of one of the most intelligent minds the Jedi had ever trained. And he concluded that the system needed to be dismantled and rebuilt. That what the galaxy needed was not the preservation of existing structures, but their replacement with something more honest and more just. He saw himself as the man to do it. When he fell toward the dark side, he did not fall because he wanted power for its own sake, or at least that is not how he understood his own motivation. He fell because he believed that only someone willing to use all available means, including the dark side's most extreme capacities, could accomplish a transformation of the necessary scale. He saw himself as someone who had transcended the Jedi's self-imposed limitations, who was willing to do what the Order was not, who would bring genuine balance to the Force, not through the slow and compromised process of working within the existing system, but through the forcible demolition of what was wrong and the construction of something better. In this self-understanding, Dooku was reading the Chosen One prophecy through the lens of his own story. He was a man of extraordinary power and extraordinary grievance, who had been inside the institution that kept the prophecy and had watched it fail to live up to its own ideals, who believed he understood what balance actually required better than the masters who had spent their careers debating the ancient texts. And in some part of himself, he believed the prophecy was about him, that he was the one who would bring the necessary destruction that preceded the necessary rebuilding. That his fall was not a fall at all, but an elevation, a willingness to go where lesser Jedi would not in service of what the Force actually needed. The tragedy of Dooku is not that he was entirely wrong about the problems. He was right about the corruption of the Republic. He was right about the Jedi's complicity in structures that served power rather than justice. He was right that the existing order needed to be challenged in ways that the order itself was incapable of challenging. What he was wrong about was himself. He was not the chosen one. He was someone who had mistaken the size of his own anger and the clarity of his own analysis for a cosmic designation. He had looked at his capacity for destruction and decided it must be prophetic rather than simply dangerous. And Palpatine, who had been his master since Dooku left the Jedi Order, had encouraged that self-understanding carefully, because a Sith apprentice who believed his service to the dark side was the fulfillment of a divine prophecy was an apprentice who would not easily be turned against his master by ordinary doubt. When Anakin killed Dooku on the Invisible Hand, the irony was absolute. The man who had believed himself the Chosen One died at the hands of the actual Chosen One, in an act that Palpatine manipulated into being by exploiting the very attachments and emotional volatility that Dooku had never possessed and therefore had never understood as the mechanism the Force was actually using. Dooku was killed, not by Jedi discipline but by Anakin's rage, by the emotions the Order had always warned against, by exactly the quality that Dooku would have called weakness in another student. The prophecy did not move through the channels that anyone who studied it from the outside could easily predict. This pattern of misreading is not incidental to the story. It is one of the story's central arguments. The Chosen One prophecy was misread by the Jedi, who expected a champion of the light. It was misread by the Sith, who expected an enemy to be managed or controlled. It was misread by Dooku, who expected a revolutionary. It was misread by Qui-Gon in certain respects, though his reading came closest, because he at least understood that the Force was doing something through Anakin that exceeded institutional framework. The prophecy was held for thousands of years by beings who brought their own needs and fears and desires to it. And every generation found in it what they were most prepared to find. The Force wrote the prophecy in a language precise enough to point toward the truth, but open enough that every reader could mistake their own reflection for the destination. This does not excuse the empire. Let nothing in this telling suggest that the suffering of a generation was an acceptable price for a philosophical point about balance. It was not. The Order 66 massacre was not balance restored. The Death Star was not balance. The grinding poverty and terror of life under imperial rule was not balance. These things were precisely the kind of catastrophic imbalance the prophecy existed to prevent. But it is worth understanding that the beings caught in the machinery of these events were not simply acting against the Force. Some of them believed, with varying degrees of self-deception, that they were working towards something, that the darkness they served had a purpose. And understanding that belief, even as we reject it, helps us understand how the prophecy could survive 20 years of apparent failure, because the prophecy did survive, and it survived in two places. One of them was obvious, the other was not. The obvious place was Yoda, sitting in the fog of Dagobah, meditating on what remained and what might yet come. Yoda had reached a conclusion in the ruins of the Order that was very different from the conclusion most of the surviving Jedi had reached. He did not believe the prophecy had failed. He believed it had been misread, partially by everyone, including himself. He believed that Anakin's fall was not a contradiction of the prophecy, but a necessary element of it, that the Chosen One had to go all the way down before he could come all the way back, that the darkness had to be fully inhabited before it could be fully relinquished. He did not know if this was true. He believed it with the patience of someone who had lived long enough to understand that the Force moved in timescales that made individual certainty very difficult, but he held it. And he waited. The other place the prophecy survived was less obvious, because it wore the face of a man who did not know he was the continuation of something ancient. A young man growing up on Tatooine under twin suns, with a name that was not the name his father had carried, with a legacy he knew nothing about, with a capacity for the Force that he was not yet using, and had not yet been taught to understand. Luke Skywalker was not the Chosen One. He was the son of the Chosen One. And those are very different things. But in the 20 years between the fall of the Republic and the moment Luke Skywalker walked out of the Lars homestead for the last time and drove toward Mos Eisley, those two things had become entangled in ways that would shape the final act of the ancient prophecy. There is something the records preserved about a moment that occurred during the Clone Wars, before the fall, before Mustafar and the suit and the long exile into darkness. A moment that most of the galaxy never knew about, that the Jedi Council knew about only in fragments, and that was kept in the secret archives as something too sensitive and too philosophically destabilizing to discuss widely. This was the encounter at Mortis. During the Clone Wars, a transmission led Obi-Wan Kenobi, Anakin Skywalker, and Ahsoka Tano to a place that existed outside the coordinates of the ordinary galaxy, a realm suffused with the Force in concentrations so extreme that even experienced Force users could barely process what they were feeling. Mortis, the dwelling place of the Ones, the realm that the Father had maintained since an age so far back that no mortal tradition had preserved the beginning of it. The Father was still there, old beyond any mortal frame of reference, fading, and he knew it. And he had been waiting for Anakin. He told Anakin what he was, not in the way that Qui-Gon had told him, not in the way that the prophecy described him, but in the most direct possible terms. He told Anakin that Anakin was the one who could keep the balance, that the son and the daughter, the embodiments of dark and light, were increasingly difficult for him to contain, that without someone to stand in the father's place when the father was gone, the balance of Mortis and potentially the balance of the Force itself would be lost. He asked Anakin to stay, to take his place, to become the new keeper of the equilibrium. Anakin refused. He refused because he had people he loved and a war he was fighting and a life that he was not willing to exchange for an eternal role in a realm outside time. He refused because the offer, however cosmic in its significance, asked of him exactly what the Jedi had always asked of him: to give up his attachments, to release what he loved, to become something defined by its function rather than its feeling. He was not willing, not then, perhaps not ever. If the same choice had been offered again, what that refusal meant was understood clearly only in the legend sources that traced the consequences forward. The father's power was finite. When he died, when the daughter fell and the son fell, and the equilibrium of Mortis was shattered, the realm was gone. The Force God era ended. The containment that had held the imbalance of the dark side, the deep structural management that the father had provided across unimaginable ages, was simply no longer present, and the galaxy, without quite knowing why, became measurably more vulnerable to the kind of catastrophic darkness that would eventually express itself as the Empire. Anakin's refusal at Mortis was not a villain's choice. It was a human one. But it was a choice that meant the prophecy had to find another path. A path without divine architecture to lean on. A path entirely through mortal flesh and mortal pain. The Force, which had perhaps hoped that its chosen instrument would accept the mantle the ones had prepared for him and maintain the balance from Mortis, had to work instead through the much slower and much more violent mechanism of consequence. Anakin would bring balance. The Force had not rescinded that intention, but it would happen through his destruction rather than his installation, through what he lost rather than what he was given. When Obi-Wan Kenobi stood over Anakin Skywalker on the black shores of Mustafar, with the volcanic heat painting everything orange and red, with Anakin burning in the lava's reach and screaming things that Obi-Wan would never be able to fully unhear, the moment contained everything the prophecy had been building toward for thousands of years, and also its apparent complete collapse. The Chosen One was broken and burning. The Jedi Order was ash. The Republic was gone. Everything that had been constructed in the belief that this being would save it had been destroyed by this being instead. Obi-Wan did not kill Anakin, and the question of why he did not kill him has been debated by everyone who has thought seriously about this story. The answer that the evidence most strongly supports is not simple mercy. Though mercy was present, it was not simple inability. Though the moment was impossibly painful in ways that make certain actions feel physically impossible, the most complete answer is that somewhere in Obi-Wan Kenobi, in the part of him that Qui-Gon Jinn had trained, in the deep place where his relationship with the living Force resided beneath all his grief and his training and his institutional identity as a Jedi, something refused to close the door. Not because he knew exactly what was going to happen, but because he could not be certain that the story was over. Because Qui-Gon had believed, with a certainty, that Obi-Wan had absorbed alongside everything else his master had given him, that this was the one. And the prophecy had not said how. It had not said when. It had not said that the path would be comfortable or comprehensible or kind. He said he had loved him. He said it out loud on the banks of a lava river to a man who could no longer hear him in any way that mattered. And he walked away. And in walking away, he kept the possibility alive. It was not a strategy. It was the last act of faith that Qui-Gon's teaching had produced in him. The Force had a plan. He did not understand it, but he was not going to be the one who closed off the final corridor by which it might still move. Palpatine arrived. Vader was reconstructed. The suit went on. The breathing began. And for 20 years, the galaxy lived under the weight of what the prophecy's instrument had become. In those 20 years, something needs to be said about Darth Vader that is rarely said with adequate care. He was not simply a villain. He was not simply the dark side's weapon. He was a being in whom an extraordinary capacity for the Force had been paired with extraordinary suffering, and both of those things were still present under the black armor, even when nothing else recognizable remained. He was a being who had destroyed everything he loved in the act of trying to save what he loved, and who carried that knowledge somewhere beneath the darkness and the conditioning and the years of serving a master who had stolen his life. He was the chosen one, under rubble, under a ruin so complete that it seemed impossible anything could survive it. But the Force does not abandon what it has built. And what it had built in Anakin Skywalker was not destroyed by Mustafar. It was buried, and buried things, given enough time and the right kind of catalyst, have a way of returning. Let us talk about what happened in the years before the Battle of Endor from the perspective of the prophecy rather than the perspective of the rebellion. Because from the prophecy's perspective, what was happening was very specific. The Force was arranging for the Chosen One to encounter the one being in the galaxy who might be able to reach him. And the remarkable thing, the thing that the ancient seers could not possibly have anticipated in their precise details, but that the broad shape of the prophecy nevertheless contains, is that the being who reached him was his son. Luke Skywalker did not know he was the son of Darth Vader when he first heard the Force. He did not know it when Ben Kenobi gave him his father's lightsaber, or when he flew into the Death Star trench, or when he stood over the body of Han Solo's friend and felt the tremor of something immense approaching. He was a young man from a desert world with a natural sensitivity to the Force and a mentor he had barely known before losing him. Feeling his way through a story he did not have a complete map to, but from very early in his training, something was different about the way he related to the Force compared to the way the old Jedi tradition related to it. He loved people. He chose them over principle repeatedly, almost compulsively. He ran away from Dagobah when Yoda was not finished with him because his friends were in danger. He surrendered to Imperial forces because he believed his father could be saved. He stood in front of the Emperor and refused to fight and refused to flee because he believed that the Dark Lord beside the Emperor was not as gone as everyone else had concluded. Yoda had told him, in the simple and heavy way, that Yoda communicated the things that mattered most, that the Emperor must be faced. Obi-Wan's spirit had told him that Darth Vader must be confronted, and that if Luke could not bring himself to kill his father, Luke would need to destroy his own hope of victory. These were the instructions of people who understood the prophecy in one way. Luke understood it in another. He did not argue with them directly. He listened, and he drew his own conclusions. And his conclusions were shaped by something that the old Jedi tradition had never adequately honored. The possibility that love was not the problem. The possibility that love, properly understood, was the mechanism. What Luke had that Anakin had not had was the space to love without being told it was wrong. Obi-Wan in his exile had thought deeply about what had failed in Anakin's training, and whatever conclusions he had reached, they had shaped the way he worked with Luke. Luke was not told to suppress his feelings. He was not told that his attachment to his friends was a liability. He was allowed, in the time he had with his mentors, to be someone who felt things and acted on them. And the Force moved through him in alignment with that, rather than in resistance to it. This was the fruit of Qui-Gon's approach, coming through Obi-Wan imperfectly, but coming through nonetheless. The living Force, honored in a person, produces someone who can reach what the detached Force cannot. On the second Death Star, Luke Skywalker knelt before the Emperor of the Galaxy and told him he would not fight. He had already faced his father. He had already understood, in the way that direct contact with someone's Force presence makes certain things impossible to deny, that there was something still alive in Darth Vader. Something that had not been extinguished by 20 years of darkness and pain and the steady pressure of a Sith Lord's absolute authority. Something that, when Luke said the word father and meant it, flickered. Luke told the Emperor that his faith was in his father, and the Emperor, who had spent decades studying the Force and the prophecy and the nature of the being he had corrupted and believed completely controlled, laughed. The Emperor understood the prophecy as a threat to be managed, as a Force equation to be balanced on his terms. He had spent a generation constructing an apparatus of power so complete and so self-reinforcing that he believed he had effectively taken the prophecy off the table. The Jedi were gone. The Chosen One was his apprentice. Whatever the ancient texts had predicted, the practical reality was that the dark side ruled, and the dark side would continue to rule, because the instrument the Force had prepared to challenge that rule was wearing black armor and calling him Master. This was the ultimate expression of the Sith's long project. They had not merely survived the prophecy, they had inverted it. And then Luke refused to fight, and the Emperor began to kill him, and Darth Vader watched. What happened in Darth Vader in that moment is something that the Force itself might have been working toward for 3 decades. Not through grand events and galactic wars alone, though those were the machinery of it, but through the specific accumulation of pain and memory and loss that had been pressing against whatever remained of Anakin Skywalker inside the suit. The memory of Padme, the memory of what he had done to reach for something he had wanted to save and had instead destroyed. The memory of the man he had been before Palpatine found the door in him and walked through it. And now, his son, the child he had never known, who had come not to kill him, but to save him, dying because of a choice he had made, because of the creature he had allowed himself to become. The Force did not force Vader's hand. That is important. The prophecy was never about compulsion. It was about capacity. The ancient texts had described a being with the capacity to hold both light and dark, and that capacity was still there, buried under everything that Mustafar and Palpatine and 20 years of the suit had placed on top of it. What Luke's love did was not break through the darkness by external force. It gave the darkness something to compare itself against. It gave Anakin Skywalker a reason that was stronger than the reasons he had been given to remain as he was. He reached for the Emperor. He lifted him. He carried him, in the diminished and broken state of a man whose suit was never designed for the stresses he was putting it through, to the edge of the reactor shaft. and he threw him in. In that moment, the ancient prophecy was fulfilled. The balance that the Celestials had managed, and the Ones had embodied, and the ancient Jedi had first perceived, and the Journal of the Wills had recorded across thousands of years, and the Jedi Council had hoped for, and Qui-Gon Jinn had believed in, and Obi-Wan Kenobi had preserved the possibility of, by walking away on Mustafar, came to pass. Not with a battle, not with a Jedi's blade through a Sith Lord's chest, with a father choosing his son over the Lord he served, with Anakin Skywalker, who had always been defined by his attachments, finally using that which had been called his weakness as the instrument of what the Force had always intended him to accomplish. Darth Vader died, carrying the Emperor to the shaft. Anakin Skywalker died on the floor of a shuttle bay, asking his son to remove his helmet, wanting to see him with his own eyes rather than through the filter of the mask, wanting to be a man in his son's presence one last time rather than the machinery of a Sith Lord's instrument. He died telling Luke that Luke had already saved him. And in the Force, something shifted. Something that the most sensitive observers in the galaxy would have felt without being able to name what it was. A weight lifted, a tension that had been sustained for decades, a vibration in the Force like a string held too long at the wrong pitch, resolved into something quieter, into something like rest. And the question that has occupied philosophers and scholars and ordinary people who care about this story ever since is whether this is what the prophecy had meant all along. Whether the ancient seers who first wrote about a chosen one who would bring balance to the Force had specifically foreseen this moment. A dying man in black armor, choosing love over darkness. Or whether they had foreseen something different, something more symmetrical and more obviously heroic, and the Force had found its way to this particular resolution through a path that was less clean and less comfortable than anyone would have chosen in advance. The honest answer is that both things are probably true. The prophecy described a capacity and a direction. It described a being who would be able to do what needed to be done. What needed to be done turned out to be more specific and stranger than the Jedi had imagined when they distilled the prophecy down to its simplest version. It was not about a great Jedi defeating a great Sith Lord in a battle between representatives of light and dark. It was about the being who contained both light and dark, relinquishing the dark by his own choice. In response to his own love, because the Force had been patient enough to find the one thing that could reach him, and patient enough to ensure that thing was present at the right moment. The Jedi interpretation of the prophecy, refined across thousands of years of institutional thinking, had been looking for a champion of the light. The Force had produced something more complex. It had produced a being who was fully capable of darkness, who had lived there for 20 years, who knew it from the inside. And then the Force had ensured that this being had a son who loved him without qualification. And the combination of those two things, the full knowledge of the darkness and the presence of an unconditional love, was what produced the moment that the prophecy had always been building toward. There is a version of this understanding that should make the Jedi uncomfortable. It should make anyone who believes that the problem of darkness is simply a problem of defeating the right opponent uncomfortable. Because what happened at the end of Anakin Skywalker's life was not a victory of the light over the dark. It was the reconciliation of a being who had been both. The Force did not destroy Darth Vader. Anakin Skywalker chose to stop being him. And that is a different kind of resolution than the one the ancient prophecy's interpreters had been anticipating. Now let us turn to the question that has sat beneath this entire telling. Was the prophecy ever correctly understood by the people who were supposed to be its guardians? The Jedi read the Chosen One prophecy as predicting a being who would bring balance to the Force by destroying the Sith. That reading was not entirely wrong. The Sith were destroyed. Balance was brought to the Force. In its broadest outline, the Jedi's interpretation was accurate. But it missed so much of the texture, so much of the mechanism, so much of what the Force was actually doing and why, that calling it correct feels like calling a map accurate, because it shows the right continent while omitting every mountain and river. The prophecy did not say that the Chosen One would be a Jedi. It did not say that balance would be achieved through the Jedi's preferred method of engagement. It did not say the process would be clean or quick or involve the survival of the order that had trained him. The Jedi had inserted those assumptions into their reading because they were the Jedi, and it is natural for institutions to interpret prophetic texts in ways that place themselves at the center. Every religion does this. Every tradition that custodies a sacred text reshapes that text, over enough time and through enough hands, into something that confirms its own importance. What the prophecy actually described, what the oldest versions in the Journal of the Wills pointed toward with their language of absorption and containment and the Son of Suns, was a being who would resolve the ancient conflict not by destroying one side, but by embodying the whole of it, and then choosing, at the critical moment, the light. Not because he had never known the dark, but because he had known it fully, and in the presence of something that loved him, had remembered what he was before he chose it. That is a profoundly different theological picture from the one the Jedi had been working with. It is the picture of a being who could only fulfill the prophecy by having fallen first, by having gone all the way down into the darkness so that his return to the light was not the light of someone who had never left it, but the light of someone who had been in the dark long enough to know every corner of it and still found his way back. The ancient text's insistence that the Chosen One would come from grief, would understand powerlessness, would be born in a place of loss, pointed toward exactly this. You cannot absorb the darkness if you have never inhabited it. You cannot hold the balance if you have only ever stood on one side. This does not mean the fall was good. The lives lost under the Empire were real. The suffering of a galaxy under Palpatine's rule was real. The damage done to the Force and to the beings who lived within its influence across those 20 years was real. None of this is redeemed by the eventual fulfillment of the prophecy, but it can be understood within the context of how the Force actually works, which is not the way of a chess player moving pieces cleanly toward a predetermined checkmate, but the way of something vast and patient and willing to work through enormous and painful complexity to reach the resolution it is moving toward. Yoda understood something of this in his exile. His final years on Dagobah were not simply years of hiding. They were years of reaching toward a comprehension of the Force that his long institutional role as Grand Master of the Jedi Order had actually prevented him from achieving in the quiet of the swamp world, without the council and the politics and the thousands of decisions that had to be made about how an institution with vast power should conduct itself. He thought about what the Force actually was, and he reached conclusions that he could not have reached earlier. One of them was that the Jedi's model of balance had been subtly wrong for a very long time, that the Order had positioned itself as the force of light in a galaxy that needed not the triumph of light, but the integration of both sides under a wisdom large enough to hold them, and that Anakin's fall, terrible as it was, had been possible in part because the Order had trained him to fight the darkness rather than to understand and contain it. He passed some of this understanding to Luke, not all of it. He was an old being dying in a swamp, and there was only so much time. But he gave Luke enough to approach his father differently from how the Jedi had approached Anakin. Differently enough that the encounter on the second Death Star could resolve as it did, rather than as the Council would have predicted. Luke Skywalker did not become the new chosen one after his father's death. Let us be clear about that. The title and the role and the ancient prophecy belonged to Anakin. What Luke became was something the Journal of the Whills had described with the phrase, "Son of Sons," a continuation, an heir in the functional sense. Someone who carried the legacy of what the Chosen One had accomplished and built something new on top of it. When Luke chose to refound the Jedi Order, he did not simply recreate the institution that had existed before the Purge. He could not. He was one person. He was starting from nothing. And in starting from nothing, he had the freedom to build it differently, to incorporate the things the old order had been too large and too institutional to allow. He taught his students to listen to the living force rather than simply to the formal doctrines of the order. He allowed attachment in ways the old Jedi had forbidden. He understood that the dark side was not something to be refused and suppressed, but something to be known and understood, because you cannot guard against what you do not comprehend. He had stood in front of Darth Vader and loved him and saved him. He knew more about the relationship between darkness and the capacity for light than any Jedi Master had known since the age of the original Jedi on Tython, maybe since the age when Mortis was still real and the Father was still managing the equilibrium by the sheer force of his presence. This shift mattered not just for the Jedi Order, but for the galaxy's relationship with the Force itself. Because the Father's function, the management of the balance between the cosmic extremes, had not disappeared when the Ones died and Mortis vanished. The function remained. The galaxy still needed something or someone to hold the center between the pulling forces of light and dark that would always exist as long as living things existed. What Anakin's fulfillment of the prophecy had done was not eliminate the need. It had transferred the means. The Father's mantle, as Luke came to understand it, had passed to mortal Jedi, not to one Jedi, to many, to the institution and the practice and the ongoing commitment of people who chose, generation after generation, to stand in the middle of the storm and hold it. That was the deeper legacy of the Chosen One, not the defeat of a particular enemy, not the establishment of a lasting peace that would never be disturbed again, but the transfer of responsibility. The demonstration, through one man's catastrophic fall and unlikely return, that mortal beings were capable of doing what only divine figures had previously managed. That the capacity for balance was not superhuman. It was deeply human. It required everything a person had, and it required the willingness to lose everything and keep going. And it required love powerful enough to function as a force multiplier in the moment when all other forces had failed. But it was achievable. Anakin had proved it was achievable. And Luke built a tradition on that proof. In the legend's sources that carried the story forward through the decades after Endor, certain patterns emerged that illuminated the prophecy's ongoing nature. New threats arose. New figures emerged who carried the Force's intention forward into their era. New versions of the ancient question presented themselves for new generations to answer. And each time the galaxy fell toward a darkness severe enough to threaten the balance, something rose to meet it that bore the shape of what the ancient seers had described, a being of unusual capacity, someone who understood both sides, someone whose personal history of loss and love and choice made them capable of doing what pure doctrine alone could never have produced. The Skywalker bloodline functioned as the Force's most concentrated channel in the era following Endor, but the principle it demonstrated was available to anyone sensitive enough to the Force and honest enough about their own nature to use it. This was perhaps the most important thing the Chosen One story left behind. Not a legend to be venerated, not a prophecy to be awaited again, but an understanding of how the Force actually works through mortal beings and what it asks of them and what they are capable of when they answer. The galaxy, across the long ages of its history, had been shaped by beings who tried to impose a particular vision of what balance meant. The Celestials had managed it from above, through technology and power so vast that the beings they managed never even perceived the management. The Ones had embodied it in Mortis, holding the extremes in divine tension outside the ordinary flow of time. The Jedi had pursued it through discipline and detachment, trying to remove from the equation the emotional variables that they believed made balance impossible. The Sith had pursued their own version of it, a dominance so complete that no opposing force could disturb it, which they called balance, but which was simply the absence of everything that questioned them. None of these approaches had produced what the Force was actually asking for. What the Force was asking for was something more intimate and more difficult. It was asking for a being who would live inside the contradiction, who would not resolve the tension between light and dark by choosing one and eliminating the other, but who would hold both, feel both, be shaped by both, and still manage, in the moment of decision, to choose in the direction of life and love and continued possibility rather than the direction of consumption and control. Anakin Skywalker was that being. He was not it because he was perfect. He was it precisely because he was not. Because he had failed completely, had gone all the way into the darkness, and had come back. The coming back was the prophecy's fulfillment. Not the power that enabled the throw that killed the Emperor, though that power was necessary. The choosing to throw, the choosing to come back, the love that made the choosing possible. There is something in this that the old Jedi tradition had been close to understanding and had always, at the last moment, stepped away from. The Jedi had known that attachment was dangerous. What they had not fully understood was that attachment was also essential. That the capacity for love, which could produce Anakin's destruction, was the same capacity that produced his redemption. You cannot have one without the other. The Force did not make Anakin vulnerable by giving him the capacity to love. It made him the Chosen One by giving him that capacity. Because the being the Force needed was not someone who could resist darkness through the coldness of detachment. It was someone who could choose the light, while feeling everything, while attached to every person they had ever cared about, while carrying the full weight of mortal emotion in a Force connection so extreme that every feeling was amplified beyond what ordinary beings would survive. The ancient seers had felt this, in the impressionistic way that visions communicate. When they wrote about grief and powerlessness and a being born of loss, they were not simply describing Anakin's origins on Tatooine. They were describing the nature of the being the Force had designed for this function. Someone who had lost enough to understand what loss means. someone who had been powerless enough to understand what it costs. Someone whose love had been so complete that the perversion of it into possessiveness and fear had produced the darkest version of what they could be. Because only from that lowest point, only from a position of having been entirely in the dark, could the return to the light be the thing the prophecy described. Not a victory, a return. Not a champion's triumph over a defeated enemy, a father's choice to save his son, and the twin suns over Tatooine, which the ancient Whills had used as a symbol of balance, of two forces rising together, rather than cancelling each other, had watched it all from the beginning, had watched a small boy build a pod racer in a settlement that the galaxy had largely forgotten existed, had watched him race into a future he could not imagine, had watched him leave and fall and become something terrible and come back in the only way that was left to him, and had watched his son stand at the edge of the desert as a young man, looking up at them the same way his father had, wondering what was out there, not yet knowing that the answer to everything he was looking for was already written in the stars above him, in a language older than the Republic, in a prophecy that had been waiting for his family for 10,000 years. The prophecy did not end at Endor. Anakin Skywalker fulfilled it in the most direct sense. The Sith were destroyed. The Force was brought to a balance it had not known in decades. But the Journal of the Whills had never understood prophecy as a single event with a clean before and after. It had always understood it as a pattern, balance established, corruption forming, a chosen agent restoring equilibrium, the cycle continuing. And in that understanding, Anakin's fulfillment of the prophecy was not the last chapter. It was the closing of one cycle and the opening of the next. The Skywalker bloodline itself became something the Force moved through in the eras after Endor. Luke and the students he trained and the legacy he built carried forward the same function that the Father had maintained from Mortis for an age beyond counting, imperfectly, incompletely, with the inevitable failures that come from placing a divine function in mortal hands. But genuinely, the wisdom that Anakin's journey had generated, the hard and costly understanding of what the dark side actually is, and what it requires of those who inhabit it, and what love can do in the presence of it, was not lost when Anakin became one with the Force. It was carried into the next generation, into the man who had been shaped by his father's choice, into the order Luke built, into the long shadow of the Skywalker name across the eras that followed. Luke Skywalker did not become the new chosen one after his father's death. The title and the role and the ancient prophecy belonged to Anakin. What Luke became was something the Journal of the Whills had described with the phrase "son of sons," a continuation, an heir in the functional sense, someone who carried the legacy of what the chosen one had accomplished and built something new on top of it. When Luke chose to refound the Jedi Order, he did not simply recreate the institution that had existed before the Purge. He could not. He was one person. He was starting from nothing. And in starting from nothing, he had the freedom to build it differently, to incorporate the things the old order had been too large and too institutional to allow. He taught his students to listen to the living Force rather than simply to the formal doctrines of the Order. He allowed attachment in ways the old Jedi had forbidden. He understood that the dark side was not something to be refused and suppressed, but something to be known and understood, because you cannot guard against what you do not comprehend. He had stood in front of Darth Vader and loved him and saved him. He knew more about the relationship between darkness and the capacity for light than any Jedi Master had known since the age of the original Jedi on Tython. Maybe since the age when Mortis was still real and the Father was still managing the equilibrium by the sheer force of his presence. We are the ones now. That was the understanding he arrived at. And it was the most ancient understanding of all, older than the Sith, older than the Jedi, as old as the Jedi on Tython, who had built their 9 temples and practiced the Bendu and tried to hold the center in a galaxy that always pulled toward the extremes. When the Jedi Council of the Republic era had debated the Chosen One prophecy in their chambers above Coruscant, they had been asking a question they framed in institutional terms. Who is the Chosen One? And when will he arrive? And what will he do? And how do we prepare for it? They had treated the prophecy as something they needed to manage, as something whose fulfillment they would be present for in a supervisory capacity, shepherding the Chosen One toward the right outcome and providing the framework within which the prophecy could do its work. It is the way institutions always relate to the things larger than themselves. They build procedures around the enormous, so that the enormous becomes navigable. What they could not have accepted, and what the Force was demonstrating across the entire arc of Anakin Skywalker's life, was that the prophecy was not theirs to manage. The Force had its own method. Its method was not the clean resolution that the Guardians of the prophecy had preferred. It was the long and painful and violent and ultimately redemptive path of a single being's life. Every choice Anakin made mattered. Every failure, every moment of darkness, every occasion on which the thing the Force had placed inside him survived another encounter with the thing Palpatine had built around it. All of it was the prophecy working, not despite the darkness. Through it, there is a quality to the Force that defies simple description. It is patient in ways that mortal beings find genuinely difficult to comprehend. It thinks in timescales that make individual lifetimes seem like the space between heartbeats. It builds toward resolutions that can only be recognized in retrospect, because the path toward them passes through so much that looks like failure that it is nearly impossible to maintain faith in the destination while you are in the middle of the journey. The ancient seers who first perceived the Chosen One prophecy were not given a clear picture of this path. They were given an impression, a shape in the Force, a feeling of something large coming that would, when it arrived, resolve something that had been unresolved since the age of the Celestials. Something that had been building in the currents of the Force since before the first Jedi built the first temple on Tython and looked up at a night sky full of stars and asked what connected all of it. They wrote it down as best they could. The language they chose was imperfect, as all language is when it attempts to translate a Force vision into words that other beings can carry with them. The interpretations that accumulated over thousands of years carried the original impression further from its source in some respects, and closer to a truth the original language could only gesture toward in others. And then, eventually, after all of that, a child was born in a slave quarter on a desert world, and the long patience of the Force arrived at the moment it had been building toward. What we are left with at the end of this telling is not a simple, heroic story. It is not the story of a pure champion defeating a clear enemy and restoring an order that was good and just and worth restoring exactly as it had been. It is something more honest and more difficult than that. It is the story of how the Force works through beings who are complicated, who contain darkness alongside their light, who make choices that damage everything around them, and sometimes themselves most of all, and who are capable, in the right moment, with the right catalyst, of something that transcends everything that came before it. The Force chose Anakin Skywalker not despite his capacity for darkness, because of it. Because the being who would bring balance needed to have been in the dark, needed to have known it from the inside, needed to have lost nearly everything before the thing that was left could be the instrument of the ancient promise. A being who had only ever stood in the light could not have done what Anakin did in that moment on the second Death Star. Only a being who had stood in the dark, who had carried the dark across 20 years, and who chose in the end to come back, could have fulfilled what the seers had felt, coming across 10,000 years of waiting. And somewhere in the current of the Force, in the place where those who have become one with it reside in whatever form such residence takes, the ancient seers who first wrote it down may have felt, after all that time, that what they had perceived was true, that the impression they had recorded in imperfect language, in a living record that spanned millennia, had been, in the ways that counted, exactly right. Not in its details, not in the form it took, but in its essential claim that the Force was patient, that the Force corrected, that the Force had produced what it needed when it needed it, and that the being it produced was equal to what was asked of him. Even if the asking took a form that none of the prophecy's readers had fully anticipated, he brought balance. Not the Jedi's version, not the Sith's version, the Force's version, which was, as it had always been, the one that mattered. Balance, at last, brought by the one who was always going to bring it, the Chosen One.